edition of Joy in Our Town. My name is Ann Farrell Tate. I'm your host, and I'm delighted today to welcome our guest, the Honorable Henry Coke Morgan, Jr. Our issue today is crime, and Judge Morgan is going to be talking about some high-profile crimes that have occurred right here in Hampton Roads. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Judge Morgan, thank you for being with us today. So you were a federal judge in the U.S. District Court of the Eastern District of Virginia, and you were appointed in 1992 by President George H.W. Bush. And the jurisdiction for the Eastern District Court is Northern Virginia, Richmond, Hampton Roads, and the surrounding communities. That's
correct.
And you actually have some close ties to this area. You were born in Norfolk.
I was.
Tell us about your great-great-grandfather.
Well, my great-great-grandfather, whose name was William Walter Coke, and his brother, Alexander, were two of the very first lawyers who had offices in what used to be known as the Princess Anne Courthouse area, which is now part of Virginia Beach. But they were there in the early 1800s.
So they began the legacy for you to continue. So the Eastern District Court, it's known as the Rocket Docket. Why is that, and what is that? Why is it referred to that?
That goes back to Judge Hoffman. In the early 60s, Judge Hoffman was the only judge stationed in Norfolk, and he had quite a heavy caseload. So he devised a plan to more efficiently handle the civil cases. And his plan actually has been largely adopted in the current federal rules. And his plan enabled him to more efficiently handle the trials. And those of us who've come along after him have tried to keep the ball rolling that he started back in 1962.
And of the 94 district courts, you are the fastest in all of them.
Well,
right?
In most years, our court has the fastest docket in civil cases.
So now you've presided over many important cases in this area. Can you share with us a little bit about some of the cases you've presided over?
Well, one case that I thought had a lot of interest was the Renegades Motorcycle Club. There were 30-some defendants indicted, of which 13 went to trial. And that was an issue in itself, trying 13 people at one time. And also, the club had threatened to blow up the courthouse and to snatch the defendants when they were being transported from the local jail to the courthouse. So they brought in the SWAT team that had handled the McVeigh trial in Colorado and to work with us on this trial. And we also had a bomb-sniffing dog because they threatened to blow up the courthouse. None of this happened.
Thank goodness.
But we did have a little practice session in the courtroom one time, and the SWAT team came in there and told everybody to hit the floor. So I was looking and watching everybody hit the floor, and all of a sudden this voice says, "You too, Judge." So I hit the floor myself.
Everyone didn't rise, everyone got down.
That's right. And it ended up, of the 13 defendants, 4 of them were convicted of felonies, serious crimes, and 4 were convicted of minor crimes, misdemeanors, and 4 were outright acquitted. So it turned out to be a very interesting trial.
And you had another case with Senator Holland, right?
I did, and that case had some very unfortunate developments. I didn't know it at the time, but Senator Holland's wife passed away 3 months before his criminal trial. And of course, Senator Holland's son, who was with the same bank where the senator was president, was also indicted. And so they were tried together. And when I was hearing the case, I kept wondering where the evidence was. So finally, when the government rested, I felt that they had no case. And so I granted a motion to acquit both defendants on all charges.
Oh, my goodness.
And then there was another surprise for me. It turned out that just a few months before the trial, there had been a new statute passed which permitted attorney's fees to be recovered from the government in a criminal prosecution if the court found that the government's conduct was vexatious. And that's an interesting development because, of course, the judicial branch of our government, under our system of checks and balances, is supposed to be the watchdog for other branches of government. So I found that they had overreached in this prosecution, and I did award attorney's fees in favor of both Hollands. And the government appealed that award, and Senator Holland died himself just before the Court of Appeals sustained the award of attorney's fees.
Was that the first time that had happened? Were you one of the first cases to?
It may have been the first. It was certainly one of the first.
So you set precedents for cases coming after you.
Well, there have been some cases under that statute, not as many as you might think, but there have been a few since then, that's true.
You would think that would be a deterrent for some people bringing these cases.
That was the purpose of it.
Yeah.
But of course, you have to find more than just the fact that the people were not guilty. You have to find that the conduct of the government was vexatious, and that's pretty rare. That doesn't happen very often.
Well, tell us about, you had another separation of powers case with Congressman Pickett.
Well, Congressman Pickett, although he and I were, before I was on the bench, I was associated with a different political party than Congressman Pickett, but we were good friends. And I remember him telling me before I went on the bench, he said, you know, I, in my service as a congressman and in my service in the Virginia legislature, have to spend a great deal of my time keeping the executive branch of the government from riding roughshod over the ordinary citizen. And I thought about that when he said it because, of course, that's our constitutional duty. And that was some of the best advice I ever received because we are called upon to rein in the executive branch of the government when it goes too far.
Yeah.
That's part of our caseload.
Now, I remember I read about one of your cases, Robert Holohan case. He was a Naval Academy graduate, also a Vietnam veteran, who just really kind of broke bad, and he ended up throwing a pipe bomb into a restaurant where his estranged wife worked. How do you, I mean, that's so emotional, and you know, to watch a man like that, a Naval Academy graduate, a Vietnam veteran, just kind of, you know, go down a wrong path. How do you, when you're dealing with these emotional cases, separate your personal feelings and they've got to get to you, to your heart as you're presiding over them?
Well, it's particularly difficult to put that aside when the defendant is a veteran who's served his country, because you can't expect someone to serve their country in a wartime situation without it having an effect on them mentally. And unfortunately, we have not done as much as we should have done to take care of veterans in that situation. So I felt bad about him, and particularly he was a Naval Academy graduate, as is my son and your husband. And so it was difficult, but you have to put that aside and when you're deciding cases and decide them on the basis of the evidence that's before you.
What has been your most memorable case, the one that stuck with you the longest?
I would say the Holland case, because the case was so unusual with Senator Holland. Fortunately, he went back to work at the bank and in the Virginia legislature after he was acquitted. In fact, I'm told that the Virginia Senate gave him a standing ovation when he returned to work. And I would also congratulate the Virginian pilot on that, because there were a lot of articles about the Hollands being indicted, and usually there's only one article when somebody's acquitted. But Tom Sheehan, who was a business reporter for them at that time, did a series in which he profiled Senator Holland's return to work at the bank and his return to the Senate, which I thought helped to clear his name and reputation, which should have been cleared.
So There also, I've read about a lot of Pentagon procurement fraud cases. It seemed like that was a big problem a while ago, and I even read that more than 50 corporate executives, defense consultants, and military officials have been convicted on guilty pleas. Is that something that you have found to be getting better, or is that still a big problem?
Well, if it's going to be a problem, it'll be a problem in our community because there's so much government procurement and so many government contracts in our community. So we would have more cases of that nature than others. I would not say that it's any better or any worse. There's always, when you have an organization as large as the federal government doing business, there are going to be a certain percentage of people who don't do it the way it should be done.
I read one time about just, we all kind of have, they talk about having a dark side, and do you find some of your cases that you see just real normal, law-abiding citizens just sort of have a break bad moment and just do things that you never saw coming?
I see that happen, but it's the exception and not the rule.
That's encouraging.
Yes, usually the people that are brought before us for federal crimes, it's very rare that they don't have some sort of prior criminal record. But nonetheless, you always feel better when the person finishes serving their sentence if they come back and straighten themselves out. So that's really rewarding when that happens. It doesn't happen as often as I'd like.
Well, have you had people that you've put away that have come back to you later?
I have had people who have come back, and when you're released from federal prison, you serve a period of supervised release. You're not just put it on the street. Supervised release is supposed to help them adjust back into society. So if they successfully complete their supervised release, sometimes we release them early because they've done so well, and when we do that, that's very rewarding.
That's got to be rewarding. Well, Judge Morgan, I thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we hope that you'll stay on with us and talk about a book that's out that's been written about the Eastern District Court called From Marshall to Moussaoui, and it's a book by John Peters that covers more than 200 years of court cases that have been heard in the Eastern District. So we will be back in a moment. We hope you'll stick around. And also I want to remind our viewers to please check out our Facebook page. We are on Facebook, and you can go to facebook.com and look up TBN Virginia. Thank you so much. We'll be right back with Judge Morgan. Welcome back to Joy in Our Town. I'm Ann Farrell Tata, your host, and I am here today with Judge Henry Morgan. The Honorable Henry Coke Morgan, Jr. is a federal judge in the U.S. District Court, and we are continuing our conversation about famous cases in the Eastern District. Now, Judge Morgan, John Peters wrote a book called From Marshall to Moussaoui, Federal Justice in the Eastern District of Virginia. And there are so many cases that are really famous, and probably a lot of people don't even realize that Aaron Burr in 1807 was actually tried for treason right here in the Eastern District. So how did you get involved? The book covers the 200 years or over 200 plus years of cases that have been tried in this area. How did you get involved with this book?
Well, the book was actually the brainchild of Judge Claude Hilton in the Alexandria Division of the court, and he recruited judges from Richmond, Norfolk, and Newport News to work with him in the Virginia Historical Society for the Eastern District of Virginia, and as a result of that, John Peters was hired to write the book. And a number of judges, including Judge Hudson and Judge Tice from Richmond and Judge Prince from Norfolk, participated as members of the committee. But you talked about the Aaron Burr trial, which brings up a very interesting point. In the early 1800s, John Marshall was the Chief Justice for 34 years. What a lot of people don't understand is that during that 34 years, he only spent about 2 months a year being Chief Justice. He spent the other 10 months of the year being a trial judge, doing very much like what I do today. And one of his trials was Aaron Burr's trial for treason. And Aaron Burr had done some things that President Jefferson thought were not in the best interest of the country, and he was very interested in seeing Aaron Burr convicted. But he was acquitted by Justice Marshall. And it's interesting because Justice Marshall, along with George Washington and James Madison, were all members of what was then the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, along with George Mason and Patrick Henry, were what were called anti-Federalists. They were not members of a political party because Thomas Jefferson didn't believe in political parties. So Marshall and Jefferson were cousins, but they were political rivals. So there was a lot going on in that trial. But whatever Aaron Burr did wrong, Justice Marshall felt that it was not treason, so he was acquitted.
Well, and now the Moussaoui, that's Zacharias Moussaoui, who was charged on 6 counts of conspiracy with the 9/11.
Correct.
So that's another famous one that was heard right here in this area.
That was heard in Alexandria by Judge Brinkema.
Oh, yeah.
And he was convicted, and the only one of the people thus far involved in the 9/11 attack who've been tried and convicted.
And I saw some of the papers on that trial. Apparently he had a lot of outbursts and a lot of strange things happened during that case.
Well, I think he wanted to use the trial as a platform to promote his own agenda of propaganda.
Yeah. So now, another thing that probably a lot of people didn't realize is a lot of the civil rights trials were heard right here, and including during the massive resistance, there were a lot of activity with the civil rights, and it was Judge Hoffman.
Judge Hoffman was one of the very first judges in the country to hear the cases that grew out of Brown against the Board of Education. One of the first ones involved Seashore State Park in Virginia Beach, where I was working at the time. And what happened is that Judge Hoffman ruled that park had to be integrated. And we had a regular public beach where families could go and swim for the day. And when Judge Hoffman ordered that it be integrated, the state closed it and put me out of a
I
job.
was going to say, what happened to your job?
And my
You had
job
no
was
more job.
gone. So interestingly, in 1958, he also presided over the case where the state of Virginia had closed schools in various parts of the state, including Norfolk. All of the public schools in Norfolk were closed. So they had to have summer school to help make up for that. And I got a job teaching in high school in Norfolk for the summer while I was going to law school. That was my first teaching job, and I've been a part-time teacher ever since. So I was affected by his rulings. But what's important about his rulings is that although he went through a lot of personal pain while he was making the rulings, it was just a relatively short time, a couple of years, and everybody realized that he was a courageous man who had done the right thing and everything straightened out without some of the violence that we had in other parts of the country and other parts of the state.
Well, and they honored him isn't the courthouse named for him?
In 1982, then Congressman Whitehurst introduced a bill to name the courthouse after Judge Hoffman, and that was done in 1982.
That is such a wonderful, footnote to what had to be a really difficult time going through all of that, standing alone for something that's right, but standing alone.
And he was pretty close to alone. There were some people who were standing beside him, but a lot of people weren't, and he went through a lot of grief. But I remember the first Bar Association meeting I went to in 1960, and he spoke to the bar, and they gave him a standing ovation.
Wow, that's great.
So that was only 2 years after his ruling in the school cases.
Wow,
which was very unpopular at the time, but people soon realized that he was right.
Yeah, and he was right. So now we also have a big legacy of maritime cases, and I understand the Titanic case was heard here in the Eastern District.
That's true. Judge Clark and later Judge Smith heard that case involving the treasures that were recovered from the Titanic, and it was an interesting case from the standpoint that our court had jurisdiction over the Titanic, even though it was sunk off of Ireland. And then the question came what to do with the artifacts. So the court ruled that the artifacts had to be kept intact, and that case went on for quite a long time.
And there's isn't it a maritime law, the finders keepers rule?
Well, there are maritime salvage laws which go back many centuries. We had another case that Judge Kellerman heard about a Spanish ship that sank that was full of gold.
The USS, it was the Central America.
Right.
USS Central America.
Right.
That was my husband's first case when he got
Oh,
out
is
of
that
law
right?
school.
Well, that was a very famous case.
Yeah.
And again,
I remember that finders keepers rule applied in that case.
right.
And Herndon, I think, was the captain of that ship, the Herndon, Virginia. So there's so much history right here in Virginia.
Well, there certainly is. I mean, admiralty is one of the oldest fields of law, and back even in the early 18th century, there were a lot of admiralty cases which judges like Justice Marshall would come to Norfolk and hear those cases.
Well, one thing that I thought was really remarkable, and it probably happened with the Titanic, but in the USS Central America, descendants from people that were actually on the ship came out of nowhere, and as did the insurance companies. I mean, that is amazing that they have those kind of records to come back and try to make claim.
It is amazing, isn't it?
That's got to be a really interesting area of law, I would think.
Maritime law is very interesting.
So as a judge, you have to know about so many things, so many topics, so many.
Well, fortunately, we have law clerks to help us with that.
So let's talk about the espionage cases. Those are always, disheartening, but the John Walker, I guess, is that probably one of the most famous that was heard in the Eastern District?
Yeah, that was a spy case, and one of the very interesting cases more recently was the Hamby case, which Judge Dumar tried, where an enemy combatant, according to the government, was an American citizen. And Judge Dumar said that, well, he's an American citizen and he's entitled to the rights of American citizens. He was actually, the appellate court actually disagreed with him on that, but the case then went to the Supreme Court, who agreed with Judge Dumar and said that he was an American citizen and he had the rights of an American citizen. So that's another example of, just like the Aaron Burr's treason trial, where it's up to the courts to see that the federal government doesn't go too far in their treatment of defendants who come before our court.
That's very encouraging to know that there are those people in place to make sure that the law is upheld. And
that's what the separation of powers is all about.
Yeah.
That's why we have that.
Well, can you think of some other? I know the medical malpractice, I guess, is another big area that was heard here.
We do, because of the presence of the Naval Hospital. It's inevitable that we have some of those cases. That's no reflection on the on the Naval Hospital, which is a great asset to our community, but inevitably there are going to be some of those cases, and they do come before us as judges, and they're particularly difficult cases because there's no jury involved if somebody makes a claim against the United States. So the judge has to perform not only the duties of the judge, but duties which would ordinarily be performed by a jury.
So in a typical medical malpractice, you would have a jury, but not if it's against the Naval Hospital?
Not if it's against the government, correct.
Okay. Well, I didn't even realize that you could sue the federal government. So you can sue the...
Under the Federal Tort Claims Act, you can sue the government in certain instances where they have passed a statute permitting you to do that.
So we're about out of time, but can you, thinking about the over 200 years of all these cases that are high profile and people discussed for years and really made a difference, can you think of one that sort of stands out as the most famous?
Well, I think among the most famous cases would be, of course, the Aaron Burr trial. I think the Hamdi case. We also had a very important civil case decided here in Norfolk by Judge Friedman, who's now retired, where eBay was a litigant.
Yeah.
And he held that you didn't automatically have an injunction that made eBay stop doing business, even where they were found to have violated somebody's patent. And that's become a very important case in patent law.
So a lot of patent cases are heard here too. And
They
that's
are.
Probably because of the Rocket Docket.
Well,
Like
it's,
that decided.
yeah, well, the patent office is in Alexandria.
Oh, okay.
And because so many patent cases are filed in Virginia, they're divided equally among all the judges in each division of the court. So I have the same number of patent cases as the judges in Alexandria do.
Oh, yeah. Well, it is a true honor to have you here. I know to have a federal judge on our program is such a blessing to us, and we appreciate so much your time. And it really is, it just makes you really proud to be in this area, and it's got to make you really proud to be a part of this system of determining, things that really matter to our country and to all the citizens. So we thank you for your service, for what you do. And we want to thank you so much for joining us today on Joy in Our Town. We've had the delightful conversation with Judge Henry Morgan. And I want to remind our viewers to please check out our Facebook page, facebook.com, TBNVA. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Judge Morgan, for being with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
This program has been sponsored by the Trinity Broadcasting Network and made possible by your telethon dollars. Your continual support can keep Joy in Our Town brought to your home every day. So write Joy in Our Town, P.O. Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711.